Hi, guys. Welcome to the Church Split. My name is Will. You guys know what we do here. We help you escape your church's echo chamber, learn to think biblically, and challenge the status quo. And, last time we had our guest, David Pallmann, on with Faith Because of Reason, and we discussed his story leaving the IFB and a lot of things that came up. And one of the big things that this involves in is how we think and how that the Christian faith has and always will be diverse in its thinking, but there's always going to be a unity in essential doctrines. But one of the things that is a passion of David's, and it's a passion of mine, but I think it's definitely a passion of David's, is philosophy. And it is not just any philosophy, but a particular field of philosophy, which is what is referred to as epistemology, which is essentially the study of knowledge, what is knowledge, things along that nature. So David is, he doesn't have his PhD in it or anything yet, most likely, but he is definitely a strong student of this. So I wanted to have him on as a follow-up episode because some of our listeners are people who desire to really learn and dig deep in some of these topics. And I wanted you guys, some people, if you don't know the realm of philosophy, it can be very intimidating and it can almost be overwhelming. So I don't want you guys to be overwhelmed. I want you guys to just hear some of this stuff. And if this is something that interests you, maybe I'll have David give us some recommendations at the end of this episode of places for people to start. So anyway, with no further ado, David Pallmann, the one and only. How you doing?
There's actually another one. My uncle has the same name. But I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, okay. Well, the one and only that I know of. Actually, apparently there's another IFB clone of you because my new roomies who just moved in from the IFB, they knew David Pallmann, and apparently he was extremely IFB. And I was like, oh, I'm going to interview David Pallmann tonight. And they're like, David Pallmann? And I'm like, oh, no. Not that one, not the one you're talking about. No, different David Pallmann. So maybe you're not the one and only. So, all right. Well, David, now we talked about your story of leaving the IFB, and now you are a self-promoting radical internalist, a foundationalist, and a few other ists that people probably don't know what we're talking about. And that's okay, because that's what we're going to discuss a little bit today. This will be a bird's eye view and a nice introductory view on how this goes about, because philosophy is important, right? So I don't know if you know, I heard this all the time. I'm sure you did too growing up, that to get into philosophy was to compromise the very word of God. So I think it's important we discuss this because I don't think that's actually true. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, you can't study that, man. I mean, haven't you ever read Colossians? Colossians 2, it says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy or vain deceit. So yeah, no, can't touch philosophy with a 10-foot pole.
Which is...
Because that's totally what Paul... Yes. That's a good response.
Which is totally a philosophy.
I did a whole paper of that actually while I was in an IFB school about Colossians 2 and what it's actually talking about. But no, yeah, the word there is just talking about don't be taken captive through philosophies or vain deceit, which are not after Christ, but that are after the traditions of men. And actually, it presupposes that there's such a thing as Christian philosophy, because it's saying beware about being taken captive through philosophies that are not after Christ. And so if you want to avoid being taken captive through philosophy that is not after Christ, you had better, can I say darn on this show?
You can say whatever you want, yes.
Okay, then you had better darn well know what Christian philosophy is, so as to avoid being taken captive by the philosophy that is not after Christ. And so actually, I think that Colossians 2 presupposes that there's such a thing as Christian philosophy, and then at least strongly implies that we had better darn well be familiar with it.
I totally agree. And that's, by the way, it's funny. I actually pride myself in being more of the uncensored church show. I kind of enjoy that. Call it my edgelord in me. So deep down there's an edgelord and he has to exist. But anyway,
necessarily exists.
Okay, we're already getting there. So the thing is that one of the things, so you already said that there is a presupposition in such a verse that there is a Christian philosophy, and theology, which is the study of God, naturally and by necessity is connected to philosophy, because philosophy is the way we make sense of reality. It's the very way that we perceive things. It's the way we see and the way we make sense of it, and we justify and coherence and all these things that you use. Oh, well, this makes sense to me. When you say this makes sense, or, oh, that seems true, those are by nature attached to philosophy. So people have a tendency to just think that like philosophy must be something like hedonism or something. No, that's a type of the many philosophies. Philosophy is just a very large umbrella. So anyway.
One thing that's important to realize is that everyone has one, right? So something, and you'll appreciate this as someone from the IFB, is that like I would hear a lot of preaching of like, I don't care about man's philosophies, I just want to know what the Word of God says. That is a man's philosophy, and it's not a bad thing because we all have one. Everyone is a philosopher, and the only question is, are you a good one or are you a bad one? And as I was saying to you before we recorded this, if you say that you don't do philosophy or that you're not a philosopher, that's a big hint that you're a bad philosopher.
I say, it's and one of my favorite things is like, yeah, you definitely know someone's a bad philosopher when they say morality is subjective, but meanwhile always cry with make moral outcries and say that society is unfair. It's a good sign of someone who is not a good philosopher, because you're holding two inconsistent positions. So anyway, so theology and philosophy are important, and they go hand in hand. And when you learn, and one of the big things you and I were talking about before we started recording was that philosophy is attached to apologetics. Now, people who are an avid listener of this show are aware of the fact that I am passionate about apologetics, extremely so. And I wish I could talk about it more on the show, but it always takes us different directions. But apologetics is one of my big things. And apologetics is simply making a defense of the faith. But depending on your philosophy will radically shift the way you try to defend your faith. With that being said, is there anything you wanted to comment on that as far as how apologetics can directly, like, actually a great example, maybe the differences between a classical apologist or an evidentialist versus a presuppositionalist?
Yeah. So if we're going to talk about epistemology, one thing that I think really makes that relevant to our faith is that, we are called to be defenders of the faith, that we're called to be apologists. And so when we are being apologists, then we are trying to give justification for believing that Christianity is true. We're trying to give reasons for thinking that it's the case. And so that connects us to epistemology, because epistemology is a study of knowledge. And at least we'll probably get into why this is controversial later, but the traditional definition of knowledge is a justified true belief. And so this issue of justification links epistemology inextricably to apologetics, because if we're trying to give a justification, then that's going to be determined, like what we think that means to give a justification is going to be determined by, what we think justification is, what it looks like, what's the structure of it. And immediately there, you're doing epistemology. So your apologetic will be shaped by the sort of epistemology that you hold. And so by realizing that and by focusing in, drilling down on that, then, we can see, are we being consistent with our own epistemology? And so, you bring up that there are different apologetic methodologies. And the reason there are is because there are different epistemologies. So if you're a presuppositionalist, for example, and there's a whole bunch of different types of presuppositionalism, but basically their argument is that, well, if you don't presuppose the God of the Bible, you can't know anything at all. Well, that's a knowledge claim. So that is, it's tied to an epistemology. You're going to say that no other epistemology can get you knowledge, so you have to presuppose out of scripture. That is an epistemology. And in fact, presuppositionalists, pretty much they will acknowledge that. If you're an evidentialist in your epistemology, then there is a sort of epistemology known as evidentialism, right? You think our beliefs are only appropriately held when they're based on evidence. So how are you going to defend the faith? Well, you're going to try to show evidences that think it's the case. Maybe you're a Reformed epistemologist, right? And that can be a sort of apologetic. You think that you actually don't need arguments to believe in God, and that it can just be a belief that you can be warranted in holding because maybe it's produced by a properly functioning cognitive faculty, something like that. So kind of how we defend the faith is very closely tied to our epistemology. I'm sorry, that was probably a much longer answer than you were looking for.
Oh, no, actually, that was awesome. No, that's the kind of thing what I mean, like where you want to break down on here for people who are like, I've heard these terms, but what do they mean? And just so you know, just because we don't hold a certain position, I do attempt to steel man the positions. Now, granted, I might add a cheeky remark, and let's be honest, most cheeky remarks are some form of a straw man. Okay, we can understand that's what memes are. Memes are never intended to properly represent. They're made to make fun. Okay, so anyway. So that, yeah, absolutely. And what's funny is I think more people, right when you mention like evidentialism, okay, well, that means I have to provide evidence for my position. And it's funny how many people might even be like, well, no, you can't justify knowledge without God. But meanwhile, they do try to provide evidences. So it's almost like they're, there's a little bit of having your cake and eating it too there. But a lot of people do that where they don't quite realize it. So I think a lot of people don't realize that they're actually trying to do evidentialism without even noticing, because that's one of the biggest things I hear nowadays. All right, do you have the data? What evidence do you have for that position? Things along that nature. So anyway, it is an interesting discussion. So one of the big things in epistemology, now again, epistemology is the study of knowledge and its nature. So when it comes to your apologetic, now what position of apologetics do you say, as far as methodologies, do you hold to?
Yeah, so I would be kind of an evidentialist, but I don't have a problem with classical apologetics either. So the distinction between classical apologetics and it's called evidential apologetics. I think it really should be called historical apologetics, because you could be an evidentialist in your epistemology and use either of these methods. Classical apologetics is it's two steps. You show that God exists. You show that basically Jesus rose from the dead. So, Jesus reveals to us, specifics about that God that we've already shown exists. The evidentialist, or the historical method, says, actually, you don't have to show that God exists, because the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the reliability of the New Testament, it's actually good enough on its own. And we can just demonstrate that, and God's existence is going to be required if Jesus rose from the dead, right? We'll say that that's the best explanation for Jesus rising from the dead, is that God rose him from the dead. And so really that's the only difference between the two. They are both very dependent on evidences. So they're very compatible with an evidentialist epistemology, even though one field of apologetics is called evidential apologetics. I'm good with either one, but technically I fit in the evidentialist camp. I don't think you have to prove that God exists before you could make a case for Jesus's resurrection.
Yeah, and I also am more in the evidentialist camp, although I'll oftentimes, like if I'm giving a sermon on apologetics, hey, Will, I'll do a classical approach first. And it's funny because I'll do a classical approach, even though I technically would be more in the evidential camp. And it's just because I'm like, I don't know which one needs what first for people, what's more convincing. So I'm going to, both barrels of my shotgun fire. And, we have an argument for God and we have an argument for the resurrection. Let's combine them. So it's kind of my method. Now, so with that being said, then there's the other, as we had discussed earlier, that the presuppositional apologetic is always assuming that just God does exist. So these are the three main fields. So you have assuming God exists, and then as you said, classical is giving evidence for an argument for God and evidence of the resurrection, and then evidentialist is just, hey, the evidence of the New Testament alone. And so you can just tell these are different levels, and you and I are both wouldn't consider ourselves presuppositionalists. Yeah, that's just. David Pallmann is known in all theology groups for ragging hard on his presuppositional friends. And I could actually say this, David actually lives up to the fact that he is friends with people whom he disagrees with. And that's a good thing. So, but point is here. So now this brings us to the next step. So how do you think we can get there to understanding the importances of these things and the way it relates to reality? Because that's what philosophy is, making sense of reality, to put it in simple terms. You feel free to correct me if you'd like on however you want to define that. But there's a big thing that you were talking about getting into a little bit when it comes to foundationalism and coherentism and things along that nature. Want to break that down a bit for our listeners?
Sure. So kind of just to go back then kind of from apologetics to epistemology, we defined that as the study of knowledge. And what is knowledge is kind of the first question. And so historically, this has been understood to be a justified true belief. And each part of that is important, right? Like, can I know something without believing it? I don't think so. What about if I believe something, but it's not true? Then I don't know it, right? So it's got to be true. I've got to believe it. But I also maybe I just pulled this belief out of a hat, right? That, that God exists, right? Maybe I just, randomly decided I'm going to believe it. Maybe I even happen to be right. But it seems like that it's still, I don't know that. I got to have some kind of reason for it. So it's got to be justified. So knowledge would be justified true belief. Now, the true belief part, that's not really controversial. When we're talking about justification, particularly, we're not talking about the Christian doctrine of justification, right? Justification by faith, not what we're talking about. We're talking about epistemic justification. And that just means having an acceptable reason for believing something. But now that it seems easy, right? If I just say, oh, well, why do you believe this, right? Why do you believe that God exists? Seems like you should have a reason for that, right? Why do you think the Bible's true? You should have a reason for that. Why do you believe that you can't lose your salvation? You should have a reason for that. Why do you believe you can lose your salvation? You should have a reason for that. So it's really intuitive that we kind of need these reasons, but it gets difficult when you can actually ask, why do you, believe that reason, right? So maybe, why do you think you can lose your salvation? Well, the Bible teaches it. Why do you believe the Bible? Oh, well, because it's God's word. Why do you believe it's God's word? Well, because it says so. But that will only work if you already accept that the Bible is true, which is what they had just asked you. So the thing is, you can keep asking the question. You can keep asking the why question. And this engenders what's kind of known as the regress problem in epistemology. And I really think this is what motivates epistemology. Because everyone, when we're a kid, we always just, why, right? The problem is, in epistemology, those people are known as skeptics. They're these people who say, and they don't usually really exist. It's just kind of a hypothetical person that you're fighting with. Is, well, what if somebody wants to know? I should have reasons. And so epistemology, the classic battle then is to defeat this enemy of skepticism. And one of the most powerful arguments is this regress argument, is that you can just keep asking why, right? And it looks like our options here are that, either just going to bottom out somewhere and you're like, well, I don't actually have a reason for that. It's like, okay, then what about that top belief that, depended on all these reasons? It kind of looks like that reason isn't actually justified at all because we got no reason at the bottom of it, right? And that's where the skeptic wants to kind of go with it. So some responses that have been formulated to this, well, one would be coherentism, right? Maybe this chain of reasons, it goes in a circle, right? It kind of loops back on itself. Philosophers have some problems with that. It looks like you're engaging in circular reasoning, right? We're not actually getting any justification. We're just going in a big circle. Also, what if we have, multiple circles, right? Like I can justify any belief just by making a coherent set for it. How am I able to differentiate between the circles? Another thing is called the isolation problem, is that it seems like you could justify any belief just by making a coherent circle for it, right? As long as all the beliefs fit together, I can get any belief to be justified that way. So coherentism it's been more popular in the past. It's not really all that popular right now. Another solution would be, what about infinitism, right? Maybe the reasons just go on forever, right? Maybe they never end anywhere.
It's kind of a lazy response.
The thing is, it hasn't been taken very seriously, but recently, it has people who are defending it in the literature. And at one point, it kind of seems like, well, it's obviously false, right? I mean, we don't do we have an infinite number of beliefs? I mean, I don't. we can't hold an infinite number of propositions for any one belief, let alone all our beliefs. How can there be these infinite chains? So the infinitist is, of course, going to be careful to say, well, yeah, of course you don't have to know what all the reasons are, but they just continue. You just don't know what all of them are. But this infinite chain is there, so you don't have to worry about it. The question is, well, how do you know the infinite chain is there? Maybe it's not there at all. If you are admitting that you can't contain it all in your mind, then you don't really know that the chain is there. Maybe more fundamentally, maybe the chain is there. But it kind of seems like that doesn't matter, right? If I don't know what all the reasons are in that chain, it doesn't seem like the belief is really supported, right? Like, let's say there's this fantastic argument for God's existence out there, but I believe in God because I like sour cream, and I don't have any other reason for that. It kind of seems like this great argument for God's existence doesn't support my belief, right? If I'm not aware of that argument, then my belief in God isn't justified by that argument just because it exists. So in the same way, even if this infinite chain really exists, if I don't know what all the members in it are, it seems like it kind of doesn't matter. It seems like it's not justifying my belief because I got no awareness of it. So another solution, and the one that, of course, I favor, is foundationalism. It says, well, the chain stops at some point. You've got a belief that you're justified in holding, and you're justified in holding it on its own, right? And I would say that that's probably the most popular solution to the problem. Now, questions, of course, arise here. Well, how is it that that belief itself is going to be justified, right? It's not supported by another belief. So how does it get justified? And so, of course, you've got theories that they can justify themselves, theories that they can just I don't have to know why it's justified, things like that. My own theory would be known as the theory of direct acquaintance. So it would say when you're directly acquainted with some fact, and maybe I'll give a little explanation of a direct acquaintance. It's kind of like an awareness. So if you've got a headache, and you believe that you have a headache, are you really inferring that belief from some other belief? Because I don't make an inference to the belief that I have a headache. I would say that there's just this way that it's not a belief. So I would want to say that's a direct acquaintance. The fact that I have a headache is something I have a direct acquaintance with, and it's something I can't be wrong about either, right? Because people want to bring in skeptical threats, particularly a visual perception, right? Like if I see something, people want to raise a question like, well, how do you know your vision is giving you accurate information and stuff? But in the case of the headache,
because then it goes almost into absurdity, right? At some point. So that's why direct acquaintance to me makes sense.
Right. In the case of the headache, right? Even if, it's like the thing you kind of can't be wrong about that. If you feel the pain, you feel the pain. And I would extend that point, of course, to what you see as well. Well, yeah, we have hallucinations, see things that aren't really there, but we still see it. So there is this level, in my view, of certainty for some beliefs, and the way they're justified is by direct acquaintance.
Right. And I agree with that. Otherwise, what you end up doing, for me, if you don't believe in direct acquaintance, and of course, then, okay, well, like I said, how can you trust your eyes? How do you know you're not in a simulation? And then it can just get into complete absurdity, where it doesn't seem like it's actually attached to my direct perception of reality, with what's directly in front of me. And that's why in philosophy, in many ways, I'm also what's under, it's a whole nother cadard, but I'm what we call I'm a realist or realism. That's where I kind of hang my hat. So anyway, that's another discussion for another time, but we'll move forward. But for that, I'm like, no, there's this thing, it's called reality, and you have to make sense of it. And I think direct acquaintance actually is as someone who suffers from chronic migraines, it was funny when I was actually watching your epistemology episode on this, and you hit the headache part. It's like, oh yes, yep, I can relate with that hard, because if somebody was like, Will, how do you justify that you have a migraine? I'm like, because my head's splitting right now and I can't even think right now because all I feel is throbbing. Thank you for condescending me in such a way. Now, do you have Excedrin or not? So
yes. So yeah, that's the idea behind it, is that basically it's just this direct connection that you have with reality, and you don't have to give a further belief at that point, right? It's this thing called an acquaintance. So an acquaintance is not, it's not a belief. It's just this direct connection to a part of reality. And so, and of course, there's objections to this theory and such, but that's the theory that, I mean, in my own channel, I've defended it in detail against contemporary objections. But so that's kind of how I look at it. Now, what all these options we've looked at here are fit broadly into a theory of justification known as epistemic internalism. And internalism says that you've got to have some awareness of something that justifies your belief, because otherwise it's no different than picking a belief out of a hat, right? If there's nothing that like makes a difference to me between my holding a belief because I picked it out of a hat and the belief that it's actually some reason I have for thinking it's true, like it's based on the principle that we shouldn't just be assuming that our beliefs are true, that there needs to be some reason for thinking they are. And so that's why internalism poses this kind of awareness requirement. And that was pretty much assumed up until the 1960s. And then this new idea came along called externalism. And externalism says, nah, you don't need the awareness there. And so I'm not gonna straw man them, but they don't like justification. I should be a little more careful here. So we said that the traditional definition of knowledge is a justified true belief. Most externalists are going to want to say, get rid of justification, bury it, kill it, get it out of here. Let's talk about warranted true belief. Now, it does get confusing, right? Because somebody like Alvin Plantinga, he doesn't like justification. So Alvin Plantinga is going to want to talk about warrant instead. But then you have other externalists like Michael Bergman who do use justification. And so it's very confusing. But what we're all talking about here, what we're all trying to get at is beliefs that are appropriately held. So a belief that has what philosophers are going to call positive epistemic status. That is, it's not something that's just a stray hunch. It's not just an arbitrary conviction. It's something that that you can hold appropriately, that you're like, within your rights, as it were, to hold it. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make it too complicated, but yeah. So the idea here is normally that you don't have to have any awareness of why your belief is correct, but they don't want to just say, oh, a true belief is knowledge. So instead, they're going to put some kind of reliability requirement in there. So it's going to be something like a true belief that came about through a reliable process, or a true belief that came about through properly functioning cognitive faculties. So this is externalism. There's not awareness here, but there is this other requirement that there's got to be some kind of reliability condition. So they'll be foundationalists in the sense that they think that the chain stops with a belief that you're, allowed to hold, that is what they're going to want to say is warranted. But you're not going to know why it is. So you're not going to have any actual reason that you're aware of, at any rate, for this belief. It's just in virtue of the fact that it was actually, like, ontologically, it was, or maybe I should say objectively, that might be a better word. It was objectively formed by a reliable process. So even though I have no, from my perspective, I just found myself believing this, it's still okay, because from this third person perspective, nobody actually has, but this third person perspective, it came about reliably. It's okay. And that's popular right now. That's like the main theory that's out there. Like, my position, internalism, was like, it's Descartes, that's outdated, we don't want that. So this is actually an epistemology. This kind of view, that is the main view. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because when you get into externalism and stuff, I know it's definitely what's in vogue now. And it's funny you mentioned Descartes, because actually my friend Brian, my co-host, his wife, actually will quote Descartes from time to time, and it is just funny to me that you mentioned it. So I was like, hey, so there's one person who'll enjoy this episode. But the thing is when you're dealing with like and one of my problems with, I'm not sure if I can articulate this well without getting too technical. My problem, I guess for me, is like when you get to externalism, when you're just going to warranted, then it almost seems, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I'd be curious to have a conversation about this, because this is what goes on in my brain, is when you go to just warranted beliefs instead of justified true beliefs, when you're going to warranted, then you're kind of granting the floor to most any belief, because, well, as long as you've had whatever thought, experience, subjective, arbitrary, whatever, it becomes warranted. So that's when you end up with a lot of people with really crazy ideas, and they're, oh, well, it's warranted. You know, they've experienced X, Y, and Z. But is it a justified true belief? Is my question. So yeah, I can tell you seem like you're chomping at the bit. Go.
Well, I say we can take it even further than that, right? So yes, there's the question of, well, you know, effectively, I'll let you just take any belief that you hold, and then you can say, oh yeah, it was warranted. It came about through a reliable process. You're going to ask me why? I don't know why. I don't have to give you a why. It came about through a reliable process. Possibly. I mean, I don't know that either, but you know, if we're allowed to play that game, then I can play it too. And this is what Alvin Plantinga, by the way, does with belief in God, because he says if you can just, you know, say that your belief that what you see, what you hear, whatever, that it's warranted, you don't have to have any reason why, right? Then I can do that with God. I can say that my belief in God is warranted. I don't need an argument for it. And so kind of, if you hold to the externalist view there, then that is a danger there. But I think we can take it further than that. It's further than just that it allows for basically any belief to be warranted. What about a belief that you have overwhelming evidence against? You could have a belief that's completely made incredibly improbable or impossible by the evidence that you have, yet if it's formed reliably, then it's going to be warranted, given a very basic sort of externalism. Now, externalists are familiar with this problem. So what they're going to want to say is, okay, well, we're going to make provision for what they call defeaters. So a defeater is something that, you know, is basically a reason to reject a belief. So it's negative evidence against something. They're going to say, okay, well, then let's modify it. It's not just that it is a warranted true belief. It's a warranted true belief that isn't overcome by a greater defeater, right? So maybe my belief, like maybe I believe in God, right? Maybe that's a properly basic warranted belief, but then there's something like the problem of evil, right? Well, now I've got a defeater for my belief in God, right? One of the problems with this is that it seems kind of inconsistent, right? Like I don't have any kind of requirement that I have to have awareness of reasons for my beliefs, but if I have awareness of something against a belief, then that means I have to reject it. Why is the negative important? Like, why is negative evidence important, but positive evidence just isn't? Seems kind of inconsistent, right? So normally they're going to want to like bring up other arguments for externalism at that point. But I do think that there is kind of that tension there, that if you, because, you know, we want to ask why. Well, what's the intelligible reason for saying that I should reject a belief because I don't have, or because I have an argument against it? And it's because it seems irrational, right? It's irrational to hold a belief if I have evidence against it. But that same logic is also going to apply to the positive requirement, that it seems irrational to hold a belief if I don't have evidence for it. So, you know, that's one way you can go about responding to externalists who try to kind of modify the thesis by saying, oh, well, yeah, we'll allow for defeaters.
Right. And well, then is when you allow for defeaters, and this is what always kind of got me. And again, maybe this is just because Will has an ape brain. So, oh, now I'm going to get stoned. Thanks. So, so the thing is that it kind of sticks out to me. Like you said, it is that problem. I'm like, well, wait, if we allow for negative defeaters, but we say, anything positive, the positives doesn't matter because you don't have to justify it, right? You don't have to justify it. You just need to have it warranted. So the positives up to that, you don't need to justify it. So you don't need to worry about the evidence is for. But suddenly when the negatives come out, you're right. It is that weird inconsistency that's like, but how do you balance that out? And I don't know. I've heard a few arguments in response, and I just haven't found it to be convincing. And again, I'm not saying that these people are complete total morons and all of that. I think we're all wrestling with pretty deep stuff when we're talking about this stuff. So in order to wrestle with it, you can't be a complete idiot, I would hope. Maybe there's a few outliers out there, but it is that idea that it's like, well, if you, in a sense, and this is kind of what always came to my mind, is to keep the law of non-contradiction in mind. If negative things that are defeaters are allowed for externalism, then you are saying that they have to justify that warranted belief to some degree.
Yeah, or at least you have to, you're saying internal reason, you're saying reliability isn't the full story. So you are effectively, and here's another question you could raise too, is they're basically assuming their cognitive faculties are functioning properly. The externalist is just assuming that. But he's going to say, but if you give me a reason to reject it, right? So we got evidence against it, then, okay, I'll reject the belief. But a question comes up here as well about, doesn't the very presence of defeaters maybe give us a reason to doubt that we should just be assuming that our cognitive faculties are giving us reliable information? Like if there are instances where you can determine that the belief that your supposedly properly functioning cognitive faculties gave you was false, what on earth is making you think then that in cases where you don't have those defeaters, but it is working right? Like what licenses that assumption, especially in light of defeaters? So, that's just a proof that they aren't always functioning properly. The externalist is going to admit that. So then that I think gives a very serious reason for doubting that they just are in general.
Exactly. And as someone who has also, and then also I can't help but think of the people with various different mental disabilities. And there's a lot of things like that where it's like, well, different people have different cognitive abilities and different people have it. So again, where the internalism position makes a lot of sense, where it's, well, no, for example, my youngest brother, he's got a couple of mental disabilities, and he used to have night terrors, and you'd have to kind of slap him out of it almost. Like you had to try to as he's screaming and flipping out, you're like, hey, come back to reality. There was a justified moment there, if you want to really go down to what was going on psychologically, for him to believe that something terrible was happening because of past experiences and everything else. So again, for me, there's also real world implications to what we're saying here. Otherwise, we're just saying, well, it's warranted, but anyway, I'm not going to get into that too much. But just one of those things that kind of always sticks out in my mind when I always think of those moments, like with the night terrors with my brother, where I'm like, well, how did we'd have to kind of reason with him, because he was experiencing something. He had a direct acquaintance with something, and he was trying to make sense of said thing. So you had to, okay, so I would kind of go into that. Do you have a justified belief of what you're experiencing? And it helped him when he was 6 years old, going through some terrible things. Kind of make sense of it. But this also, like you said, this presupposes that your faculties, your mental faculties are working properly, which brings in the other question of whether or not we can actually think or be autonomous. There's a comment on your YouTube page from a friend of mine, actually, that got it was on my page when I shared your video. It was hilarious because the person said when you defended autonomous reasoning, that you were defending Western culture. And I was like, wait, no, this is epistemology, not what? That's not, those are different things. So yeah, I think it'd be interesting to explore that. Do you believe that people have autonomous reasoning, or is it something with nature versus nurture, what you're simply predisposed to, and that you are to some degree predetermined to just think and function the way you are?
So to some extent, you're gonna have to unpack, what do we mean when we say that reasoning is autonomous, right? So in the video that fellow was objecting to, I was very deliberately utilizing presuppositionalist language, and I said that in the video. Like I said, there are ways that human reasoning is not autonomous, right? I think we are dependent on kind of the acquaintances that we're given, right? So there's a sense in which we're not autonomous there. But that's not what the presuppositionalist means by it. He means that if you think you can get knowledge without presupposing that the Bible is true, basically, then that's autonomous reasoning. I think I can get knowledge without presupposing that the Bible is true. So by his definition of the word, I believe in autonomous reasoning. Is that the word I would have chosen to categorize it? No, I just call it reasoning. But but they call it autonomous reasoning. And so, that's why I use that term. Was I trying maybe to, as you might say, poke the bear a little bit to, get maybe make it a little clickbaity? Okay, maybe I was, but and then that's okay. I was using their language, and I made that clear in the video. And so yes, I thought if I had a big title screen that said "In Defense of Autonomous Reasoning," that would definitely get them upset, and it definitely did, based on like the number of response videos that have been made to it. But do I think we can be autonomous in like a really true sense of that word? No, I don't even know what it would mean to say that to have knowledge means you have knowledge of something. Minimally, you're dependent on that something. Like otherwise, you're not going to have knowledge of it. So, I mean, knowledge by the nature of what it is, it's not really an autonomous thing. But what the presuppositionalist means by that, yeah, we can have knowledge without assuming the Bible is the word of God.
Well, right. And otherwise, I always find that such an absurd thought anyway, that you can't have knowledge without assuming that that's the word of God. I'm like, what? But then how do you justify all of the people who are non-believers, who are highly intelligent, who do lots of inventing, a lot of doctor work? They seem to have a lot of knowledge. Just
this is where they go like, oh, they got proximate knowledge, but they don't have ultimate knowledge. You're like, the heck?
It seems like at that point you're just creating a weird arbitrary distinctions. It's like, no, there's a difference. I would just simply say they don't acknowledge transcendental knowledge. They don't understand transcendental knowledge, but they definitely can understand knowledge of reality around them. With the physical universe, they can interact with it, they understand it, they have direct acquaintance, if we might use the phrase, things along that nature. So I find it very strange. It's a very strange thing, but you're right. No, so when it comes to being autonomous, I like yourself, also, so knowledge is external from us, right? So that's not, so anything that I believe. What?
I would say knowledge itself is a belief, so it's something that's internal to me. But what it's directed towards, what it's knowledge of, knowledge about, is going to be something external.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
It can be.
Right. So it can't be fully autonomous because my reasoning depends on knowledge and things outside of myself. But also, there's things where it's like cognitive ability. Awareness, there's all these other things. So yeah, we're not fully autonomous, but that doesn't mean that, and of course this goes into that free will discussion if we really wanted to jump down that rabbit trail, which is another 3-hour discussion. But if you wanted to get to the 3-hour discussion but then that gets to the free will discussion of, of how that operates. And obviously you and I both are believers of, at least to some degree, of a free will. I'm pretty sure that you are anyway. I think
gotta bow to God's sovereignty, Seth.
Oh goodness.
Come on, Will. You got to believe in the sovereignty of God. Haven't you read Romans 9? Come on, man.
Oh yes, I've read about it. I've read about Israel.
They didn't obtain what they were seeking because they didn't pursue it by faith. Oh wait, we don't read that. We don't read the last few verses of Romans 9.
Now, there's a few inconvenient moments in Romans 9, primarily where it starts and where it ends.
Yeah, or if you finish the argument out into Romans 10 and 11, that they really don't like that.
Yeah. I always segue from Romans 8. I'm like, well, you know, it said this here, so with that in frame, anyway, that's a whole other discussion.
You're right.
It's a whole other discussion, and one I would happily have, because I am a huge. I'm sorry, I have a lot of Calvinist friends. Actually, a ton of Calvinists listen to this show. One of the very people who run the RFP themselves is more of a Calvinist / Reformed person. So I have friends that are Reformed. I just very much disagree with Calvinism, because I don't think it could be justified true belief. Actually, it can be, but I'm just being a troll at this point. It can be a justified true belief. I just think it's false, and I think the arguments are bad. I'll just put it that way. Now you can screech at me in the comments. Okay. Otherwise, all right, let's just bring where rubber meets the road, because we've talked kind of broadly about a lot of things, right? We discussed, philosophy, into epistemology, into what is knowledge, we've gotten into foundationalism and coherentism, we discussed that coherentism, a lot of things we can make a lot of things coherent. It doesn't necessarily make it true. So I'm not saying truth will be coherent, truth will be coherent, but it does not mean that coherentism is where it stands. So anyway, I just want to make sure that was clear. But so we got into coherentism and foundationalism. You said that you believe in foundationalism. I'd agree with you that there is a bottom line at some point. It does stop. And in order to justify that, you kind of have to be, in many ways, an internalist. I know there are other positions, but I think internalism is probably the best way to dodge that, where it flows from the other, I feel like, more naturally. So with internalism, I have a direct acquaintance with things, and that's where I start building my justified true beliefs, and then exterior knowledge and blah 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 blah. Go down that road, and then you could get into how it works as far as individuals work with knowledge. How do you say, David? Because a lot of people who are probably listening to this are going, okay, yeah, great, but how does this affect my Christian walk? How does this even impact my Christian life? Does it matter that I even know how to do these things? Can't I just live my life and just assume that, hey, I have knowledge, I don't need to understand how it works? So how would you think that this makes the rubber meet the road?
Yeah, so I mean, you can do that, right? And kind of one way I say to determine if you're going to be an internalist or an externalist is, am I really okay with just assuming my beliefs are true? Basically, like, am I just okay with assuming that at the bottom, yeah, it was produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties? I can't verify that, but I'm just going to believe that. If you are okay with that assumption, there's not a lot I can do to help a person like that. Because when we're kind of at this level, I mean, we're at the bottom. Like, I can't appeal to something below that to show you that that's wrong. I can just, try to say, I can try to give reasons why I don't think that that's a good way to go. But yeah, I mean, if someone wants to do that, you can do that. The question, though, is, are you really interested in having true beliefs? And like, not everyone is going to like go into this in the kind of detail that I do. I get that. But you kind of want to be self-conscious in this area, right? Because one thing I found is that every belief that we hold, practical beliefs that we hold, it all really does come back to this question of, well, what is it that we really think justifies beliefs? And it will also really help you to like identify like really bad arguments as well. Like when somebody's like sometimes I'll just hear you like make an appeal to coherence, and like you pointed out, well, yeah, coherence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you got to do more to show me that something's coherent. So, I mean, is it going to be terribly practical? I mean, maybe not. Maybe not if we're dealing right at the foundations in this kind of abstract stuff. That may not seem practical, but it does have relevance to what is practical, because really most of the disagreements we're having, I mean, even like political stuff, like over like abortion or like what's a good theory of economics, this stuff does come back to what you think constitutes justification, right? This constitutes, do you think evidence, is important? Can I just like maybe to take an example of like if we're arguing about doesn't an unborn person count as or rather does an unborn, maybe they would want to say fetus, does that count as a person? Is that a human life? Well, are you going to make an appeal to, oh, well, it's properly basic, I'm assuming that my belief about it, is formed reliably, or are you going to provide evidence for that, So, I mean, there are real world practical implications here. So, I mean, it is in some way hard to give an easy answer to that question. I would say it affects the practical, even if it's maybe not directly practical.
One of the things that comes to mind is nowadays we have subjectivism massively on the rise, right?
Ugh.
Yeah, exactly. Instantly, everyone starts choking, and yeah, it's awful. So subjectivism is on the rise. Part of that postmodern, like, hey, we redefine terms by your own thing. But the thing is that externalism, in many ways, allows for that a little bit. I can't tell you how many times I've argued with and had discussions and debates and conversations with people on that far end of the spectrum, or even within actually the IFB themselves too. Let's not make it exclusive to just the left, the extreme left, which is easy to poke fun at. But let's also talk, okay, so then also what about the IFB stuff? A lot of them will just bring it down to almost an emotional appeal, right?
Yeah.
Because and to them, that is, they are warranted in their belief. And the thing is, it's like, okay, yeah, that's great, but what does the evidence say? And you could say, well, we allowed for defeaters. I'm like, yeah, but what if you have some defeaters, but they have some defeaters, but who has a stronger evidence? Then are you saying that stronger evidence against doesn't matter as much? It might not be a full defeater. This might be evidence to the contrary on the opposite end of the spectrum, if that makes sense. So for me, there are real world implications when you start building from the ground up and you start seeing, especially when as I've seen subjectivism on the rise, I'm like, yeah, I think in an effort to, try to make maybe knowledge a bit more, the idea of knowledge to be more digestible, because I feel like that's kind of what externalism is. It's like, well, it's what's warranted and, these things. I think what you've gotten there, though, is almost the fact where you're justifying, well, maybe we should use that language, but you're allowing for some really bad beliefs just because of those situations. Am I making sense?
Yeah, and I think your example before of taking it back to the IFB, like here's one example. Like I would fight with my parents vigorously over this King James only issue, right? And I would want to appeal to evidence. Like I've got all this evidence here that shows that this story that you're telling about the King James Bible is not true. And what are they going to appeal to? Well, they sound like, I hate to, but almost sound like the Mormons with the burning in the bosom. I mean, it was like, well, I just read the King James and it sounded like the Word of God. Or I read the King James and I felt the Holy Spirit in this in a way that I didn't feel when I read the NIV, Bad epistemology. But if you think that you can just make those kinds of appeals, I mean, yeah, you can really justify any belief, and that does lead to subjectivism, right? Because well, I like the NIV because God told me, and I like the Book of Mormon because I felt the burning in the bosom. You just got it's so subjectivized that yeah, it becomes very problematic. And of course, not just in religious beliefs, but that was a good example.
And again, and I'm not saying that all externalists fit that bill. It's one of those things that every time I read more and more about externalism, I'm like, I think this allows a little bit too much credence to some of those positions a little bit more. And as someone who just despises, and who knows, maybe, and just for grace on people who might disagree with me, it could be my pendulum swing, right? Like just my response, right? Anything that is remotely reminds me of some of the horrible arguments I've experienced in my life. you know, maybe that was just my whole thing. Maybe I just wanted to run away from it. So that's my thought there. So before we wrap up this particular episode, was there anything you wanted to really add when it came to this that you want people to think about? Because this does have real world things, even though it seems like, oh man, you guys are just getting far too complicated, but it's not when you really understand the implications of where it can kind of lead. And again, I'm not trying to straw man anybody. I can't emphasize that enough. It's just, these are the thoughts that I have when I read them. Like, I've experienced X, Y, Z. I've had a direct acquaintance with X, Y, and Z, and man, I just don't. I think that allows a little bit too much credence for some of those bad arguments, because we're just allowing for warranted, and we're not making them justify their true belief. So anyway,
well,
I digress.
In one sense, that is kind of one of the most important things, I think, in making the case against externalism, is having a strong internalist alternative, which I would say should be based on the theory of direct acquaintance, because one of the big motivations for externalism is that, well, if you put this internalist awareness requirement on knowledge, you're going to end up in skepticism, that you can't actually get justification for belief. So actually having a working theory to show how you can get, like, from direct acquaintances to, say, even, you know, our religious beliefs about God and stuff, that is itself incredibly valuable, because externalism, it's not going to look good if you can make the case on internalist grounds. That's where it gets its popularity from, is that, oh, well, if we don't take externalism, if we're internalism, then, you know, we're going to not ever be able to know we're not brains and vats. So, you know, showing that to be false is going to strip externalism of its main motivation. But sorry, you asked me a completely different question, didn't you?
No idea. I think we just, oh yeah, I was just asking if there's anything you wanted to add. Sorry, I'm like, I just enjoyed the conversation, and I will talk all night. This is just the way I roll. So yeah, no, I was just asking if there's anything else you wanted to add here, as far as like how you think this relates to people on a real scale level before we close up at all, or if not, then we could just jump into how you think this can impact your evangelism.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think it is probably not in any sense obvious, because you can get along without reflecting on these kind of deep, what a philosopher is going to want to call a meta level question. Like, if you just kind of assume the reliability of your cognitive faculties, you're going to be able to mostly function in life, because most people aren't going to ask you, you know, why, down to that very base level. For me, I appreciated having the intellectual just assurance of knowing that all these beliefs I had up here actually were justified, and it didn't just all bottom out with an assumption. If that is something that is valuable to a person, then you've got motivation to go there. But then, you know, beyond that, just the stuff we already touched on is, you know, this provides a powerful solution to things like relativism, because this is also the motivation behind relativism, is that, oh, well, nobody really knows anything at all, you know, we're all just kind of going with our assumptions. If you can show that to be false, you've got a lot of motivation to look into epistemology. So it is deep, it is dirty, but like here's the thing, is I'm not professional philosopher, not by any means, and you know, I've mostly taught this to myself by reading, and I'm not a super smart guy, so if I can do this, you can do it too, right? It's not quick going, it will be slow going, you know, and that's okay. You know, you go one book at a time. There's plenty of good introductory material out there. I did a series, you know, on my YouTube channel. You can get the information for free. It just does require putting some brain work in to it. And so, you know, I get it's not going to be for everyone, but yes, there are important real world ways in that it can help.
Right, exactly. So, and I think that's helpful too. And so do you have any, a couple introductory books that you would recommend people for as sources outside of your channel?
Well, yeah. My channel goes a little bit deeper on some of these things, though, even maybe than introductory material. So there's a really good one called How Do We Know by James Dew and Mark Foreman. And it's very short. It's like probably 150 pages, very accessible, and it's written by Christians as well. So it's kind of comes at it from a Christian perspective. They even kind of have a chapter on the epistemology of religious belief. They don't really take my position on it, but that's okay, because this is just an introduction to the issue. And I've read a lot of introductions on it. None has really connected with me just like this book. So even if you're not a believer, not a Christian, this is just a good book to get you into it. How do we know? And then kind of maybe if you're looking at the religious side of it, there's a good book called Debating Christian Religious Epistemology. And if you're kind of familiar with, like, Zondervan has like these 4 views, 5 views books where authors of different positions get to interact. It's a book like that. And so it's written introductory at an introductory level. It's got 4 authors, but they all like have a short essay, you know, and they're easy to read because like each chapter is just very short. They get an essay to lay out their position. All the other authors get to say, hey, here's why they're wrong. And the original author gets like a final essay to be like, to respond to those criticisms. But at the beginning, it's got like a little introduction to religious epistemology. And so those are 2 books that I think are really good, really helpful.
Awesome. Yeah, I love the 4 view books. They're just so helpful if you're like, I don't know anything about
like, I don't even know how to think about this.
Yeah, I'm completely clueless. I have no idea what direction. And so you read the 4 view books, and then you're like, oh, I have a direction now to look into this. And you know, and it's also helpful because you just see steel manning each other, you see interaction. I guess that your brain moving. And as somebody who also appreciates rigorous debate myself, I love those books. So anyway, yes, thank you for the recommendations, and I hope some of our listeners take you up on them. So anyway, now how do you think, real quick, that this idea of a philosophy and the knowledge of epistemology, sorry, when you're talking about like, anyway, okay, whatever. So, and going through epistemology, how do you think that studying philosophy can help unite the divided body? That's what I ask every single one of my guests.
Honestly, I think it's that it humbles us so much, because like the more I study philosophy, like I'll be honest with you, I thought like I would probably read like 2-3 books on epistemology and I would have it down. No, people spend their whole lives on like one issue, like on what's the definition of knowledge. People spend their whole career on that. And so just kind of, it's one of those things where like the more you learn, you figure out there was like the less you actually knew to begin with. So studying philosophy, it'll do a lot to humble you. And when we are humble, that is actually one of the best ways for us to be united under, of course, the lordship of Christ. It's just when we realize we don't have it all figured out. We've got a lot to learn. And it encourages like this idea of reasonable disagreement, that like people can disagree with you and not be stupid and not be wicked and things like that. And so philosophy at least has really helped me to realize how much I don't know, that things are just not easy. And so it inspires a little bit of, you know, humility when you go into these topics. And so I think that is at least one way that it can help us to be united.
I totally agree, because of, you know, humility is one of the many attributes we ought to have as Christians. And as somebody who's accused regularly of being arrogant and prideful, it is always a good reminder. And that's actually what's funny. I'm like, I probably just come off that way, because if there's something that's emphatically wrong, I will stand a hard line and I will speak very, very passionately against it. Doesn't mean I hate you. It means I'm just like, the particular idea you're espousing I find to be problematic, and I'm going to speak harshly against it. And once in a while you do find a wicked person. We're not saying that that's not a thing, but in most cases, cool the cannons. Because most likely you can have just a good discussion. That's actually one of the things I love the most. The other day, I got a really great conversation with a guy I'd never met who was a Christian, and we completely disagreed on an area of scripture. But it was such a mature conversation. I was like, dude, I'd get with that guy any day of the week, just because it was so enjoyable. And because we both acknowledge the fact that we've done a lot of study, but we also respected the other person's position. And again, as I said, the more you study this stuff, the more you realize how much you don't know. And there's certain things I do know. And there's things I can know confidently, I can know strongly, I can speak boldly against or for. But then there's other things where it's like, that's complicated. And this is my position, that's yours. Here's my problems with your position. And they'll go, here's my problems with yours. And I'll go, okay, cool. Let's grab coffee and talk about it. And have fun. So it'll be good. So, all right. David, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk people through that. I think it was one of those things where I'm like, I've wanted to talk about epistemology on here with somebody. I had Dr. Liz Jackson on a long time ago. And if you guys haven't, please go listen to that because she is brilliant. I love Dr. Jackson. And she's very jovial, very happy, and smart, and also has debated some major atheists. And I thoroughly enjoyed her laying the smackdown on T-Jump. And yes, that was a good time. Did you watch that one, David? Did you watch it? That was I enjoyed that entire thing because I don't know. She's not to throw too much shade, but we can throw shade at garbage philosophy. The tears just weren't. So sometimes you go to a debate to just, you like, okay, this is going to be really two smart intellectuals go head to head. And it'll be really interesting. And there's other times you're like, dude, you're outclassed, bro. Like, you're just in a different realm. It's not your fault. Maybe it is. I don't know. It's rough. Anyway, I felt the same way about Braxton versus Dillahunty, where I was like, oof.
The thing is, with some people is, and T-Jump and Dillahunty are both definitely these kind of people. I call them atheist presuppositionalists. T-Jump doesn't like it when I call him that, but they have like this one trail that they want to go down, and like that's it. And so it gets kind of boring, honestly, just listening to like T-Jump debates and Dillahunty debates, because it's always like T-Jump is always like, well, I can explain that through naturalistic pantheism, and Dillahunty's always like, I'm just not convinced, and like we don't get anything more than that.
The Dillahunty dodge. Oh, I'm just not convinced. Yeah. I'm like, okay.
Do you have a rebuttal?
Well, yeah, a response would be great, man. It kills me. Like Dillahunty was one of the first people I had ever listened to in a debate, and I was like, and even when I was fresh into the SM world, I'm like, okay, I've heard some amazing, like, if you ever listen to like, oh my goodness, the Irish Christian man, older, he debates Dawkins.
Oh, John Lennox.
Yes. I'm like, why am I struggling with this guy? Listen, watch those debates. It's, they're both intelligent people talking on a similar level. And I'm like, I could sit down through that and not want to vomit most of the time, or, choke on a rusty spoon. But anyway,
have you seen Jay Dyer versus Tom Jump?
No.
Oh, I get. Watch that. Just if you want to laugh, watch
Okay.
Jay Dyer versus T-Jump.
Jay Dyer, T-Jump. I know what I'm doing tonight. So, all right. Well, David, thank you so much for being on the Church Split. I really appreciate it. And guys, go check out the resources he recommended. And as always, stay tuned for the next episode. We love you all, and God bless. And I don't know, go study some epistemology and go get confused somewhere. So.